those days, the mom stayed with the babies in the hospital for a whole week. During that week, Ronald and Sharon and Albert come up and visit, and we often thought about how Ronald and Sharon were probably 12 and something like 11. And they said, we just walk tall so that people won't know that we aren't 14. They weren't to visit if they were, unless they were 14 years old. But we had lots of nice visits those evenings because the Vaughns were there with their baby, Rosalie Turner, and I can't remember his first name.
Charles?
Their little baby was a girl, was Robin, and they didn't live here many years after that, but we did have some good times. And I remember I was during that time, trying to think how we would remodel our house. That was in 1946. We remodeled some, but not according to the elaborate plans I had when I was in the hospital. Also, I wanted to tell a little bit about my sister Clara. During the war, came to live in a small house in our yard. And then after Lester came home from the war, Albert built a bigger house for them. Beverly was a baby there, and the reason I was reminded of that today, I ran across this picture of Ronald. He was to play Santa Claus in Christmas in Mexico. He had solo parts, and I was grateful for my sister's sewing ability because I didn't like to sew. So we had a real fun evening when Ronald sang the Santa songs in the 5th grade. In this house then where Clara and Lester lived, Nancy and Janine both were born. But sewing made me think of my quilt. When we were first married and lived in Jim, I pieced this flower garden quilt, which is my only piece of handiwork I've ever done, but I'm quite proud of it because it is my own piece. I was very careful to get all the flowers, stems, toward the center with the yellow centers, and then a contrasting piece to outline the yellow center. I didn't have it quilted for years, but just recently, Janice's mother took it home to Longton, and her church ladies quilted so that every stitch in it is done by hand, including the beautiful scalloped edge. She was fortunate enough to find some old material. It isn't easy to find these matching shades of white these days. So that's one of my treasures. When we were living in Jim, I had been used to heavy schedules, taking extra classes in high school, being the editor of the school paper, the Colby High Life. In fact, the Colby High Life originated the year I was a junior in high school. So I had lots of good experiences doing that. And then I also got to be valedictorian in 1931. So then being married and moving to Jim in November, time was kind of tedious, so I'm glad I took time to make the quilt. In fact, I probably worked on that instead of ironing white shirts, which I did not like to do. Then we need to remember the fact that Albert put in a big scale, probably in the late 40s, early 50s, and an appropriate scale house, which was extra nice to weigh the big trucks as they increased in size. What did they eventually carry in those years, Brian?
Probably 350 bushels.
350 bushels.
That'd be the very most, I think. Yeah.
What do you carry now?
600 in that type of truck, and we have semis too now.
Semis, do they most generally have 1 or 2 boxes?
Either.
Either one, okay.
They have 1,000.
Okay. All the way from the 50 bushel trucks in 41 to now 1,000 bushel trucks. That's quite a difference, isn't it? In those years then, the 50s, the family crews came around to do harvesting. They would have two mobile homes. One of them would be for the hired men, for the fellows combine crews to sleep in, the other for the wife to cook and feed the men, which reduced the need for care from our home. We had some very favored combine crews who came back year after year from Dakotas, Oklahoma. Especially remember the names of the Ropel family, the Swanson, the Paul Swanson family, the Regiers. There was one man who was one of our favorites, and I wished I'd ask Ken tonight. What was his name? You weren't old enough probably at the time he was cutting there to remember. Think of anybody, Peggy?
Not other than the ones you've mentioned.
This fellow came back years later and visited us. He was married during the years that he was combining for us, and told us about how Albert was always so unassuming, yet he was very careful about all the details. One day he was walking through the Quonset, and the fellows were, I guess, resting there. Maybe it was showering or something, raining outside. And he kind of walked around, looked clear through, and one of the fellows looked at another one and says, "Who does he think he is?" Never having any idea that Albert was the farm owner. But he was telling that to describe how Albert dressed and worked just like any of the men there. He thought that was a real nice story, and I did like that story too. Of course, then later, Albert put up several bins, and I have a picture here to help illustrate that. Here he is with some of the bins. I suppose that was most of them during the 50s, Brian, or were there even some in the 60s? I suppose the big ones.
I can give you a date on the many rows of bins that we have. That some were built before Lon was born in January of '58.
Okay.
And then others were built when he was a year old.
All right.
I remember we have some pictures of him in a stroller out there.
I see.
Beside,
Okay.
Jim Tubbs and his father-in-law, Mr. Stutka, did the cement work and made the cones in the bottom of it.
Okay, good.
There have been others at other times too, but that was the majority of those that are all
I
lined
was
up.
thinking too that maybe you have a film of the entire procedure of
Mhm.
doing, was it the bins or the scale?
The bins.
The bins, okay. Then of course, then later there were the big bins off, the higher, taller bins off to the east. Do you remember those being constructed, Brian?
Yeah.
Those were done after Ken.
Is that right? I don't know.
Do you think so? After Ken came?
I can't say.
No, I'm sure we had them with Albert.
Before?
Oh, yes.
Okay.
Ken didn't come back until after Albert was gone.
Ropels were here.
When those were built?
I think so.
Okay.
If I remember then, and when in the later years of high school, Ronald would run the combine. He would be the one who would know that.
Albert bought the combines when Ron was still in high school, to keep him from going with harvest crew, wasn't it?
Oh, I don't know.
He wanted to go with a harvest crew, and so Albert bought the combines
I never knew about that. I didn't get in on lots of things.
to keep him at home. About 2 Massey Harrises.
Well, did we have any before that?
I'm not aware of the ones that you had before that. These
I
were
know you were
self-propelled.
questioning me when we talked about 41.
These were self-propelled.
I see. Okay. Well, and I know Sharon ran the scale sometime. I assumed it was
All of them.
late high school.
Mhm.
All of high school.
And then she came home even after she was married to run the school.
Okay. And I was trying to think who else. Bruce did.
And Ken.
And Ken. In fact, Ken was waiting when the year he's married. He planned to be married after harvest, and harvest lasted too long. Sunday that they were married, that we were still cutting fruit that Sunday. Even Geraldine did some weighing. Did you, Brian, ever? You and
No,
Mom?
I remember Durley and Lynn Lawn.
I think
one
Mom
year
did.
or more. I ran the auger.
Okay. It's reflected here now. We didn't take time for lots of vacations during the years that the children were growing up, but we did do one Yellowstone visit to Yellowstone when Ronald and Sharon were youngsters, and that had been a goal of mine ever since my father took my Uncle John to visit Yellowstone when I was probably 7 years old, and of course they came home and told these great stories about how Yellowstone was, so I was so eager to see that place. It was quite primitive when we were there. We were in a small cabin where the bears came around the cabin, and we had to go outdoors to the restroom at night, and I certainly did like the big old Faithful Geyser and some of the little paint pots. It was a nice vacation. Another vacation was to the Black Hills when Ronald and Sharon were in high school, and we had Ken and Bruce along. We were driving our first big car that year. It was a white Chrysler. When we came back home, it was fair time, and Ronald and Sharon were playing in the band. Bands practiced every once a week at least during the summer in those years. Mr. Beck kept them going, so they were ready to play for the fair, and I think we had the fair later in August in those years. I guess this particular evening, Ronald had paid some attention to Peggy, and so John Stover and Jerry Beery got excited about that and wanted to tease Ronald and try to follow him home, and went around him, and in the dust he couldn't see and turned the car over. So that was our first car accident, but thank goodness it turned out real well. When Albert said he got to the boys, they were all awfully scared, so you can imagine that they were. Other vacations were to Lake of the Woods. That was with Kim and Bruce up right across the border in Canada, and they particularly liked that one. I did too. Then I think one of the most favorite ones was to the East Coast by way of Indianapolis. Got to stop at the race track there, and visited Gettysburg, visited Washington, D.C. for a few days, went to Mount Vernon, and back home through the Smoky Mountains. Another very favorite